and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Monday, June 23rd. We are coming to you with an emergency TribCast because less than 12 hours ago, as all of us were getting ready to go to bed and get ready for the week, Greg Abbott vetoed the Texas THC ban and ordered a special session for July 21st, later next month. We are throwing out our TribCast plans and talking about this because it's the big story in Texas politics. And I am joined this week by politics reporter Kayla Guo. Hello, Kayla.
Hi.
Kayla, we were talking before, went to sleep around 3:30 last night after all that news. So a lot of energy from all of us. And then Jasper Scherer. Hello, Jasper.
Good to be with you guys.
I know you were watching the NBA Finals last night, so is there at least a little bit of you that was happy that he waited until that was over?
A little bit, yeah, and it was kind of overall just like a rude welcome back from my vacation where I was blissfully, not paying the usual attention to this kind of stuff, but here we are. I'm back in the game.
Here we are indeed. I, for one, was very happy that the NBA Finals game was starting at 7 o'clock. It meant I was going to be able to go to sleep at a reasonable hour, and then I'm brushing my teeth. And I think it was you, Kayla, who dropped in our Slack channel, Abbotts vetoed SB3, and that blew up everything. Let's just start. Oh, and by the way, Eleanor Klemenoff, you may have heard of her. She's the co-host on the show. You may remember a couple weeks ago when I was in Aspen and I knew it's too important. I got to join the TribCast as a Zoom anyways. I don't want to disappoint our listeners. Eleanor also now in Aspen, and she didn't care at all. She was like, I'm skipping it. I'm hanging out in the mountains. So, Klemenoff at textribune.com if you want to email your disappointment. We're here, the true TribCast stands, giving you the information that you need to know. But anyways, anything y'all want to say mean about Eleanor before we move on?
I mean, come on.
Yeah, just the worst timing she could have possibly picked, obviously pre-engineered. So
All right.
Really disappointing.
Well, it was a wild night last night. So let's just start. Kayla, can you just sort of like walk us through what happened last night to get us to the point we were in here?
So we got an earlier round of vetoes earlier in the evening, 25 bills total, including a couple from earlier in the session. And that was it. I didn't feel off the hook yet at that point, but I had sort of prepped for two opposite outcomes if the governor vetoed it or let it pass. And then I think it was around 11:15 that the SB3 veto on its own sort of quietly came out.
11:15, which is 45 minutes before the deadline to veto bills.
Yep, 45 minutes before the deadline, 11:45 or 11:15 on a Sunday night. And that was that. So we rushed to get that up. And then in a really strange twist, Governor Abbott responded to a tweet by our friend John Moritz of the Austin American-Statesman, in which Moritz had said that a bill by Sophronia Thompson had been vetoed, and Abbott rushed in. This is just minutes after the SB3 veto, says there was a flaw in Ms. T's bill, and he put it on the special session, which was our first indication that maybe we were heading to a special session, but it was bizarre because it was in reply to a reporter's tweet. So minutes after that, then I guess it was more like 30 minutes after that, around midnight or just after midnight, after the veto deadline passed, Abbott officially announced a special session with SB3 at the top of the list.
Right. Yeah, I think I can confidently say that this is the first time a special session has been announced in a reply to a tweet, an Austin reporter. Pretty wild. I'm struggling to even come up with a question here. What do we think explains Abbott waiting until, almost literally the last minute to do this? We've known about this bill for weeks. Why did he wait until, everyone was going to sleep on Sunday night to act on this?
I think some of it was genuine indecision about how to handle this kind of a hot potato politically. I don't know if that explains fully why he waited until 45 minutes before the deadline, but at least that there were some other bills that he vetoed, much earlier on that were just obviously clear calls for the governor. And I know his, folks on his team have said he really didn't, at least initially, know how he was going to handle the veto versus, sign decision. And I think, you also saw that his veto proclamation was unusually long and detailed, sort of laying out, both his reasoning and sort of I think the governor had previously said like he was going to put on his judicial hat to kind of decide this, harkening back to his time as a Texas Supreme Court justice. And his part of his proclamation kind of read like a legal decision where he was saying like he didn't think that SB3 would, stand up to legal scrutiny, or at least it would get tied up in the courts. And then he even went as far as to suggest, kind of the regulatory framework that he'd be okay with when he calls lawmakers back in July to sort of reconsider an amended version of SB3. So I think kind of the combination of like indecision and then wanting to have as bulletproof of a explanation as possible to kind of make clear, look, I still want to do something on this. But, I think he went to great lengths in his proclamation to say, it was sort of targeted at Dan Patrick to me in some ways. I think he was like, look, I'm kind of with you on this to an extent. I'm trying to help you not get your top priority tied up in endless litigation.
Right. Let's actually step back and do a little bit of a history of how we got here, right? So Dan Patrick had been calling for this THC ban. Well, actually, let's step back even farther than that, right? These TH stores, these products have been available in gas stations, all over the place for the last couple years after the action taken both by the federal government and the state government to legalize hemp, right? This creates a situation where these sort of like marijuana-like substances that can get people high are now essentially legal almost by accident. I think everyone sort of agrees that that was not the intent of the original law. So Dan Patrick comes into this session and says he wants to ban these substances. These are dangerous for folks. The measure passes the Senate, but the House sort of like significantly amends the bill in committee, right, Kayla? Basically saying, we're not going to ban this, we're going to regulate it. Then what happens, Kayla?
Well, the House has this bill. They advanced it through committee. It's Chairman Ken King's bill out of State Affairs, obviously a very powerful committee. That bill is, it contains a lot of what Abbott ultimately recommended in his proclamation explaining his veto. It would have barred sales to minors. It would have barred marketing to minors and put some more restrictions in testing and bolstered law enforcement, all of those things. It was a pretty substantial regulatory framework. And then drama happened on the floor. We saw Representative Tom Oliverson, who is an anesthesiologist and also Dan Patrick's neighbor, introduce an amendment to substitute the regulatory framework for the full-out ban that the Senate had passed months before. We saw kind of a hodgepodge of people sign on to that, some Democrats in addition to a bunch of Republicans, and the House managed to do that. And at the same time all this was happening, there were some negotiations about school finance. Speaker Burrows has said that, they were independent and there was no hostage taking. And the school finance package was just a tough, big, complex piece of legislation to put together. But I think there was definitely some criticism after the fact that school finance and THC got tied up together. And so we saw the House pass this full-on ban, and that is what ended up making it through the legislature, in addition to an expansion of the medical marijuana program.
Right. And so then there are all these calls for Abbott to bill, people upset about the economic impact, people pointing to maybe the use of these substances by veterans dealing with various issues. Abbott kind of remains completely silent on this until this happens. So Jasper, are you surprised by Abbott's decision here?
I would say I am. I mean, I sort of from the beginning, my was that he would rather than sign or veto it, just kind of let it take effect. But at the same time, if you just think of kind of the volume, the pitch of the opposition to this, that was coming from, I mean, really the key to that was coming from the right, which is,
Mhm.
what just dictates a lot of the decision making by Republican lawmakers who are running the state right now. How is this issue going to play out in upcoming primaries? I think governor might have sensed a potential political liability for folks in his own party. So I think he just saw that like they kind of needed to not go back to square one, but just like sort of reset and come up with a version of this that might be less politically toxic when, the March and May primaries roll around. I'm not sure if this would have really been like a political killer by itself as an issue, but so I'm surprised based on like what I expected at the beginning, but just given the kind of the volume of the chatter over the last few weeks and just the intensity of the pressure on the governor, it sort of makes sense in retrospect.
Yeah, I've said this on the podcast before, but it's one of those things, right, where it's just very easy to draw a direct line to lawmakers' decisions and impact on people's lives, right? Like these products are available kind of all over the place. There's these stores everywhere, whether in like city downtowns or, small towns and everything like that. And they're going to be gone, right? Or they were going to be gone before this veto. And people were upset about that and they knew who to blame. It's not like one of those situations where you're having to kind of wade through and point fingers and explain like the complexities of school finance, right? It's like this isn't going to be here, and it's because of these lawmakers that this happened, and maybe that has something to do with the decision. The question now is what will happen next. Kayla, Governor Abbott was pretty prescriptive in terms of what he wanted to see from lawmakers on this issue. Tell us a little bit about what he laid out for wanting to see.
He laid out a long list of possible regulations. He suggested that lawmakers consider an approach similar to the way alcohol is regulated with a particular agency looking over it. Certain rules like, again, barring the sale of THC products to minors, barring marketing and packaging that is meant to attract minors. I think he had, no, something about not having stores near schools, requiring testing at every phase of manufacturing and processing, extra funding for law enforcement to be able to enforce all these rules. So he has a fairly comprehensive list of proposed rules, and there are more than what I just listed. Again, a lot of them overlap with what was in Ken King's bill. But yeah, I guess they'll come back July 21st, and this is the first thing on the agenda. I will have to see how open Dan over clear that it was a ban or bust throughout the regular session. He had forced to threaten a special if he didn't get his way, if lawmakers did pass a regulatory bill. So they're gonna have to work through that.
Yeah, I
I,
mean,
I will say, just jumping in real quick on Kayla mentioned the fact that it's on the table to ban the sale to minors of these products. I think the fact that like still needs to be done for this industry really underscores how it's kind of a free for all ad hoc system that's been operating over the last 6 years, and why there has been kind of this clamor for something to get done this session. Just the fact that they passed the bill that ultimately allowed for this industry to proliferate, intending to boost the agriculture industry. So they didn't even bother to set a 18 or 21 age limit. I think that just underscores how much regulatory clamor there is, and it also, if we're thinking about what might come next, I think even Democrats generally have been pretty on board with doing like some sort of regulation, and the debate has really just all along been about the ban versus regulation conversation.
yes, but as Kayla kind of waved at, there is another very influential and powerful statewide leader who will have a say in this, and that, of course, is Dan Patrick. You said in your story last night, or I guess early this morning, Kayla, that he had listed this as one of his top 5 bills of his career in terms of most important. He, called a press conference in which he was really blasting the media and other folks for what he perceived as being critical of this bill. How is he going to react to this, do you think? How has he reacted already?
He seems pretty mad.
Ask and
Um,
answer.
yeah, I don't think he's thrilled. Yeah, I mean, he put out a pretty blistering statement immediately on Twitter last night after the veto came out, called it a quote unquote late night veto that he argued would leave law enforcement and people whose loved ones have been affected by high potency THC products, leaving them feeling abandoned. So he's clearly disappointed. Some of his allies, like Tom Oliverson, have come out with other statements saying they're disappointed. I'll be headed to his press conference in about an hour and a half from when we are speaking right now. And I think one of the main things we'll be looking at is just measuring like just how mad he is.
Well, be careful. We all know that he threw some products at reporters the last press conference. So, just keep your head on a swivel as we go from there. I mean, it does seem though, Jasper, like Dan Patrick might be unhappy about this, but he's going to be faced with a decision of no regulation at all or regulation more aligning with what Governor Greg Abbott does. So, I mean, he is not one who's afraid to play a game of chicken with the governor, but it does seem like the governor holds, the most leverage in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see how he handles the situation, how Dan Patrick does, just because he has, I think, found success in the past kind of playing hardball on these seemingly intractable disputes. Like if you think about the property tax debacle after the 2023 legislative session, that was kind of the only other real example of Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick really being publicly and very directly at odds over like a major policy issue. I can't think of another example that really comes close to the THC situation here. But to your point, Matthew, like it's, if Lieutenant Governor Patrick comes out guns blazing and just trying to take down Abbott over this issue, he risks, getting less of what he wanted, in the first place. So I think and he's a crafty politician. He's no doubt like considering, the stuff that we're talking about here. So I wouldn't be surprised if he comes out with, at least by by the Dan Patrick standards, maybe a little bit more of a measured tone, just trying to, express his disappointment, but saying, like he still does have another chance to, try to move the ball on this issue in, a month from now. So I don't think he's going to want to establish a, kind of needlessly antagonistic relationship with the governor heading in if it's only going to, sour his chances.
Well, by the time most people are hearing this, that press conference will likely have happened. So check out texastribute.org. Kayla will have her story on it, and you'll find out what happened there.
I might be horribly wrong. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Well, Jasper, I believe the last time you were on the podcast, you and I both predicted there would be no special session, and I think maybe even kind of rubbed it in with Eleanor that she predicted otherwise. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
yes, we were wrong, and maybe it's for the best that Eleanor couldn't make it to this podcast. I mean, the other thing that sort of caught my eye, and I'm sure a lot of other people's eye about Abbott's announcement last night, was the word initial when he said the initial list of agenda items. I guess first, before we go on whether something might be added, Kayla, did anything jump out to you about other things that will be on that initial list?
Not particularly, I don't think. Some of them, looking at the veto statements, there were just flaws in the bill or, some sort of tweaks that could be made. And I mean, overall, there was a bunch of criminal justice bills that he vetoed entirely that are not on the special agenda yet. But, like none of them were major bills that any of us have been following throughout the session. But like you said, that's an initial list. I think I wouldn't be super surprised if we saw something like bail pop up on there or taxpayer funded local municipality or government lobbying, and maybe redistricting. So I think we'll see.
And
Yeah, I mean,
one of those veto proclamations nodded at that, Kayla, right? The possibility of a bail special session item. He was kind of citing the failure of one of his bail priorities as, something that needs to happen first before one of those bipartisan criminal justice bills could get through. So
Yeah.
I think the big thing people are going to be wondering and talking about between now and July 21st, though, is what you mentioned, Kayla, redistricting, right? It has been reported by us and others that there's been some pretty strong pressure from the White House to consider a midterm redistricting, specifically redrawing the congressional lines in an effort to maybe help Republicans nationwide hold on to the House. That is not on the list, but maybe it will be. Jasper, what do you think the state of play is there right now?
yeah, I think, well, first of all, baseline understanding here is like the governor can add an item to the special session call at any point. These things can last up to 30 days, sometimes less, but this very much is not necessarily the end of the agenda. I think it's been pretty clear that Abbott is kind of waiting to take his cues from however, kind of the Trump political team and the Texas Republican delegation in DC, kind of how they work out this situation. I think the governor has kind of been signaling, you guys handle this, and I'll just go with the sort of the way the winds are blowing. And what we have seen is that the Texas Republicans are, not super jazzed about the idea. They are worried about spreading their districts too thin ahead of what could be a tough midterm cycle. So it's but we've also gotten some indication that they might not be thrilled about it, but they're still likely to go along with it if the Trump folks stand their ground, which is kind of I don't know, a microcosm of how most of these congressional White House relations play out. So kind of the expectation right now is that this is going to happen and that it probably would get added to the special session call, at some point. But it's also possible that this is done in a separate session. We had four of them last year and then three of them the year before. So it's this could just be the first of multiple. I don't want to jinx us, but it's always a possibility.
Yeah, it's just such a fascinating dynamic because I can't say that I've spoken to any Republicans recently who think this is a particularly good idea for the Texas delegation, right? Many look back at last decade. We wrote a story about this back at the time about how, Republicans got really ambitious in the Texas House, trying to hold on and expand their majority by drawing a bunch of seats in Dallas County that were attractive to them. But what they did was they spread out their voters so much that by the end of the decade, Democrats had essentially won every seat in that county. They got a little bit overly greedy. When they redrew the lines this past time for the current district lines, they really emphasized longevity and, as opposed to adding more seats. And that was a conscious decision to avoid being put in a tough position at the later part of the decade. But I think the big question is, right, when the president, who clearly controls so much and has so much influence over your voters, is asking something, can you say no to them? I'm very excited to see. I think the other question here is, how would Democrats participate, right? Because they still have the ability to do a quorum break. I was in San Antonio last week interviewing some members of the San Antonio delegation. I asked them about this possibility. Senator Menendez, I'm quoting him, he said, "I don't know why any Democrat would show up to a special session where that's what you would do," speaking of the redistricting. Representative Ray Lopez coyly saying, "I've been known to leave before when the issue is a BS issue, when democracy is at stake. You cannot put a penalty on me that will keep me from exercising my voice. And if that means walking away, not showing up," and then he sort of tailed off. But I mean, pretty strong signals that they would not be interested in playing a game. But it's interesting because now they need to come back to deal with some of these issues. So I think there will be an interesting little game to be played here about, who shows up, when do you disappear, if you add it to the call, when do you add it to the call? We don't know, but it's going to be incredibly fascinating to watch.
Yeah, you could easily see some of those congressional Republicans, going along with this because they don't want to upset the Trump administration, then almost kind of hoping or banking on the Democrats, holding out in Austin so they don't have to worry about it. And it's also interesting that, like, for example, Pete said, you were talking, Matthew, about past examples of Republicans stretching themselves too thin. Like Pete Sessions is one of the kind of the more seasoned Republicans in Congress from Texas, and one of the leaders, is my understanding of, in some of these talks. And he is like a prime example of somebody who lost his seat in 2018 to Colin Allred after that, in a district that radically changed from, from when the lines were drawn at the beginning of that decade. So, I think there are some fresh memories in the delegation about, Lizzie Fletcher beating John Culberson as well. I think they're trying to avoid those situations.
We saw Hakeem Jeffries, who's the Democratic minority leader, also he wasn't necessarily bullish, I think, but he pointed out, like this could actually potentially benefit Democrats if they're not careful enough. And, you create situations where Democrats do have an edge and possible opportunity to win.
Right, exactly. It really, both sides will have their own kind of like, how much do you want to gamble on this decision to make if indeed they go through with that. There will be plenty of time to talk about that if they do. Everyone's favorite topic, redistricting, and few things can cause someone to buck their president or, decide not to show up more than, the lines that determine whether they get to keep their seats or not. So that'll be a fun one. This THC fight will be a fun one. I'm sure we will see other fun things coming up in the meantime, but we will talk about those later because Kayla's got to go cover a press conference. Thank you, Kayla, for joining us. And thank you, Jasper. Thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris. We will hopefully be back to our regular schedule next week, and hopefully we will not be working until 3 a.m. the night before. Talk to y'all next week.